Now, all anyone can talk about at this point is Navi and the Turing refresh that's coming out, but frankly, I'm very happy I got this Radeon VII because it is for a select group of people, and I'll explain that at the end of the video. But what I won't put at the end of the video is most of the conclusion. I actually think it would be prudent for me to start with the majority of the conclusion of my video first so that no one misses the point, right? Because I'm afraid of people missing the point, because people often have missed my point when it comes to things in the past, especially before I had this YouTube channel. When I used to frequent WCCF Tech before I had this channel, I would troll NVIDIA fanboys by occasionally posting benchmarks. I mean, frankly, I started by posting my overclocked 7970 beating a 780 Ti, but everyone knows Kepler sucks by now. But recently I would have posted my overclocked Vega 64, which was running at 1680 megahertz, and this is a launch Vega 64. This wasn't the liquid edition. And then the memory was up to 1180 megahertz, and I would beat 1080 Ti's. It'd usually be close, but sometimes it'd be up to 10% faster. And the point I was making always seemed to go over some of these fanboys' heads. It'd just be like, vroom, and they'd post, yeah, but I'm 5% stronger, or I'm 10 or 15% stronger even, right? 20% stronger when I overclock my 1080 Ti. And they'd think they won the argument. But there wasn't really an argument to be had there, was there? Right? My point isn't that Vega 64 is stronger than the 1080 Ti. And to be honest, I never expect it, even with fine wine, to be better than the 1080 Ti on average. But I do expect it to get a little closer. And my overall point is that Vega 64 was within striking distance of the 1080 Ti often. Especially in certain games and newer games. And there's a problem with that, right? Now, I think everyone expects some upsets in some games from time to time. Understandable. Like, if you have a 1070, you expect the RX 590, or if you have an RTX 2060, you expect the RX 590 to come close to your card sometimes, like 1 or 2 games a year, but most games the 2060 should destroy, absolutely destroy the 590. But there will be a couple times it's close, right? Or inversely, I sometimes see the 1070, or I guess the equivalent now, I guess would be like a 1660 Ti or something, to come somewhat close to a Vega card from time to time, depending on if it's like a GameWorks title. But it's understandable, right? Because they're within $100 of each other, these cards we're talking about. And so is it a big deal? And if you're like playing an Assassin's Creed and you're getting like 50 frames a second and the 1070 is getting 50 or 48 frames a second or something, and it's like, whatever, we're both going to lower some settings and play in 4K, we're all happy. It's not a big deal. When it is a big deal is when a graphics card is 40 to 100% more expensive. And the comparison I will make is one that happened when I entered PC gaming, and that's the 6970 versus the GTX 580. You have cards that are within 30% of each other's performance. One costs a lot less but has a lot more VRAM, and people would often compare them. But for some reason, people just have missed the point, and I think it's because people are spending so much money now that if something wins by 20%, people just act like it's in a godlike tier. Doesn't matter if the lower tier card has more features and more VRAM and will likely age better. People just act like it's godlike. But back then, the 580 cost like 40% more, whereas now it costs 86% more. So that's the comparison that I'm going to make, because I really want to highlight, if you're going for 4K gaming, what card do you get? Now, you've certainly noticed a mention that I haven't made, and that's the RTX 2080. And this is the part of the video which will be the only part I talk about it. And that's that the RTX 2080 is a card for no one. No one has it. If you're watching this video and you're a 4K gamer, I think there's a substantially higher chance you have a GTX 1080 Ti than you do an RTX 2080. And that's because, well, the 1080 Ti was a better card, and also because it has enough VRAM for 4K. The 2080 doesn't. It doesn't have enough VRAM for 4K, and it's only about 20% stronger than the substantially cheaper 2070, and maybe 25% stronger than the substantially cheaper Vega 64. The truth of the matter is, if you're gaming in 4K, you need more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, or at least you need ways of scraping by. Like, Vega actually provides high bandwidth cache, and I do mean if you're a budget 4K gamer, and I know they exist, a Vega 56, I have a couple friends with them, and they game in 4K. It never runs out of VRAM because of the high bandwidth cache. As long as you have 16 gigabytes of DDR4, you're fine for the next few years, even with that 8 gigabyte card. But the same cannot be said about the RTX 2080. It runs out of RAM with the top textures in multiple games already. And if you're spending over $700, compromising on textures is a joke. So that's my opinion. The 2080 is for no one, and I will continue to ignore it. And if you're going to call me an AMD fanboy or hate me or say I'm stupid for ignoring the RTX 2080, that's fine. There's a mountain of other tech channels over there where you can go read opinions of people telling you to buy a card that's on average a little more expensive, 5% stronger, has half the VRAM and substantially less features. Go ahead and take their advice if you want to. Also, a giant shout out to WillTR909. He volunteered some 2080 Ti results, and 2080 Ti results that were overclocked by clearly a true enthusiast here. This guy knew what he was doing, which I frankly rarely run into. And so it was an excellent reality check, and it allowed me to check my data with my Radeon VII. And before we get to my benchmark results, that's something to keep in mind. Even compared to websites where I pulled data from, my Radeon 7 at stock settings got average frame rates a bit lower than usual, and I'm not used to this. The last time I did a benchmark roster was a couple years ago for myself for fun, and I was usually beating all websites, but no, I need a CPU upgrade. Alright, so let's get to Radeon 7 overclocking. I've actually found it to be much, should I say, more efficient to overclock than anything, and I've overclocked plenty of things on GlobalFoundries 14 and 12 nanometer, just plenty, and basically what you find is it will clock as high as you want as long as you can cool it with liquid nitrogen and keep the power target to not limit you. That's, I guess, the benefits of GlobalFoundries, but the undervolting was also excellent, so that's why everyone was undervolting Polaris through Vega up until now. Actually, with Radeon 7, I don't actually recommend, I recommend undervolting, but it's not as much about just not upping the clock speed. Upping the clock speed is actually efficient on this node. So you go to Radeon settings, go here, global settings. First thing you want to do is turn on high bandwidth cache. If you have, well, you just want to turn it on in general. I turned it on my mining rigs that have very little amounts of memory too. It just makes things snap faster, load faster, move data faster. High bandwidth cache, again, crazy underestimated. So make sure you click that on. And you're going to go to global Wattman settings, which I have at the default for this video. So yeah, it looks much different than what you're used to seeing with Vega 64 and 56, but it's actually much better. First things first, don't touch this. This is the other P states. There's not really P states anymore. There's just a ramp curve, and it does it for you well. Do not touch this. All right. So yeah, we're going to disregard that. First thing I would just say is if you're overclocking, and this is just, not what I used in the review, but this is my general advice. First, you click this dot, and this is the only thing you're going to touch here. This and this. You click that dot, and, my default voltage is actually pretty high. I think I actually have an average Vega, which is good, I think, for this review because it will mean that I don't have a golden sample, right? And I would say you just want to probably peg this thing at like 1090, and then you just want to peg this sucker here at about 1900. And that should just be stable, honest to God. It should be stable like this. And then if you go to the fan, the default fan curve actually is fine with a normal undervolt like I'm doing now. You're going to want to ramp it up if you pushed a little farther, maybe. But honestly, this will keep it cool. I guess if you want to, I would do like this. Like move the bottom two up to here, perhaps. You still won't hear the card. And then I would probably do something like that. You want to keep it below 85% fan curve if noise matters to you. But honestly, at 85, it's not loud at all. This is perfectly fine, right? And then you're going to want to go to power limit. And Honestly, at this, you can just go plus 5%. I always recommend doing plus 5% because there's just always every single graphics card, NVIDIA or AMD, upping the power limit just a little. Make sure there's less of that, up and down boosting while you're playing, and it just feels smoother. So I recommend that. Don't worry, it doesn't really add any power usage when you game. I guess if you rendered, it might add some, but it's going to be like 5 watts, and it'll just... Don't hold back your card, NVIDIA or AMD. And you want to go to the memory, and you just click this to 1100 and then fire and forget. Honest to God. Now, I got mine to 11. Well, I actually got it to 1170, which I butterfingered that. There we go. But, in the review, it's at 1150, which is perfectly stable. It's a very typical overclock to get. But honestly, I'm not sure how much of a benefit it gets you, so I would just leave it at 1100. And it does actually benefit mining and gaming minimums a bit to go to 1100, and it doesn't affect anything, so just do it, man. Then also, you're going to want to go with memory timing level 2. I saw no stability effects by adjusting this until you get above like 1130 megahertz. So just leave it at that. It will definitely help your mining. And what it does is it makes sure it doesn't switch timings while you're playing, which again, stability is better. And then just boom, apply. And that's how you use this. Now let's get to the benchmarks. I use my own Vega 64 with the same overclock I've been using for 2 years. It's not the highest overclock, but it's an above average one. And I pulled the NVIDIA card results from the web, links in the description below. And I will be doing 1440p and 4K results at the end. Don't worry, I'm not hiding anything. And do keep in mind that my test system is weaker than most. I benchmarked my 6700K against Will TR's 909's 8086 K at 5.2 gigahertz, and yeah, with the same cards, he was pulling a good 10% lead over me. So keep in mind, I'm a bit weaker than most results on the web, and if you have a godlike gaming system, you'll be even stronger than them. All right, now the first results we'll get into actually are mining, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because I don't need to. Out of the box, this gets 90 mega hash. If it gets crazy hot in the room, it'll get down to like 85, but with the same overclock I use for gaming, it just gets 101 mega hash once I turn off the monitors. This is the perfect card for someone with really cheap energy that just mines when they're not gaming. And frankly, this card is like a Threadripper in that you can mine, browse the web, watch 4K videos, even do some editing while it's mining. It really never gets bogged down with that immense amount of bandwidth. All right, and the next results are 1080p, and I actually won't spend that much time on this because you don't want this for pure 1080p gaming. There's just almost no point. Compared, and that's the overclocked Radeon 7 to the overclocked Vega 64, and it's only 14% stronger. Granted, I'm a bit CPU bottlenecked, but I just only benchmarked 3 of the games here and then stopped. This illustrates my point, I think, pretty well. My overclocked Vega 64 was within 5% of the stock Radeon 7 in a few games, so that tells you it's literally a linear increase. Like how much you increase the core clock, that's how much more performance you'll get in 1080p for the most part compared to Vega 64. But I will say this, it's pretty funny. You can pretty much play in 1080p and increase resolution scale to like plus, I don't know, 20 or even 50% higher, and it doesn't lower frame rates in some games. So that bandwidth is literally just sitting around with the core clock unless you increase it a ton. All right, now the first game is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This is a gorgeous game that some people, I've noticed, don't see it as the prettiest, but there are it's just the engine. It's different than most, and it's very consistent in its beauty. There's not like one scene that looks great and then one scene that looks like garbage. It just always looks really good, and depending on the lighting, it can look photorealistic. And it's a very balanced game, too, I would say. So right here is your reality check. No, Radeon 7 isn't as strong as a 2080 Ti, a card that costs twice as much. Not even in 1440p. But it does beat the 1080 Ti, and it does pull quite a bit ahead of the Vega 64, especially when overclocked. I mean, if you have a Vega 64, I'd say this is a pretty good showing for if you wanted to blow some money right there. Like, we're looking at 25-30% higher performance overclock to overclock. And next up we have Ghost Recon Wildlands, which I keep because even though some people act like the graphics aren't worth the performance hit, what people forget is just how far it's rendering every single object, every single person in the distance. All of that's rendered. You can shoot people past that mountain if you're accurate enough. So this really is an interesting graphics test for those Arma-type games that have immense view distances. And in here we have another showing that, puts things in perspective. The 2080 Ti is stronger. But again, it's even with my system with some CPU bottlenecking, I fail to see how people can say this is weaker than a 1080 Ti. Once you get to a full Radeon 7 overclock, it's going to stay up there, right? And honestly, the biggest thing I got to point out is I don't know why anyone will buy a 2070. Like, this is ridiculous. There's no game where my Vega 64 can't pull ahead of this 2070 that costs at least $100 more. It just makes absolutely no sense to me. And now Far Cry 5, again, a very balanced game, I think, for NVIDIA versus AMD, and it does run beautifully. And if we go to the results here, we can see where I'm starting to get into my point, where in some games, again, right, Vega 64 right up there next to the 1080 Ti that always costs substantially more. You have the Radeon 7 firmly ahead now, and now within striking distance of the 2080 Ti. This is, again, the 2080 Ti is twice as expensive, and it's within 10%. And this does also demonstrate Radeon 7 is the 4K gaming card to get, in my opinion, if you've got money to blow, but you don't want to sell a car for a 2080 Ti. It's somewhat unfortunate that's how dumb this market's gotten, but that's where we are if all you do is care about gaming performance. But of course, you can't beat the price performance of the Vega 64 that costs half as much as the Radeon 7 on a good day. So keep that in mind. And moving up to Strange Brigade, which is probably one of the smoothest DirectX 12 games I've ever played. This and the next game are really demonstrating, in my opinion, that finally DirectX 12 isn't stupid. And if we go to the results, we can see, well, here we are. Here's a game, right? And this is a fun horde game, by the way, if you have just some friends in co-op. An excellent game to just drink a couple beers and chat with people while you play. Right off the bat, as usual, Radeon Vega 64 trading blows with the 2070, and the 1080 Ti ain't too far ahead as usual. But then the Radeon 7 is just pulling right on up there, and you're looking at something where if you turn down a couple of useless settings, I'm sure, you could be gaming 144 Hz with this thing in 4K, and it does pull above the 2080 Ti. Again, my results are actually a good 5-10% lower than a lot of websites I checked, but once you get up there, this thing... honestly, this is where you see this. And if you had a 2080 Ti, you spent twice as much. Wouldn't you be angry? I don't know. Moving on to the Division 2, which by far demonstrates that you can do great things when you build a game from the ground up for DirectX 12. It's so nice to not have stuttering in newer DirectX 12 games. And this game's pretty fun, too, I gotta admit. All right, and in the Division 2, obviously, this is AMD's greatest showing to date, I would say, with the Vega architecture. And I just keep in mind, we have Strange Brigade. The newer the game, the more it's very obvious now. It took longer than usual compared to Kepler versus GCN and Maxwell versus GCN, but we're starting to finally see that fine wine, meme going on here. Vega 64 at stock, just beating a 1080 Ti. Go ahead, overclock that 1080 Ti all you want. It's only going to get a bit ahead of the Vega 64. My overclocked Vega 64 actually got pretty close to the 2080 Ti here, which blows my mind. But I will say this, keep in mind you can overclock that 2080 Ti and use an even stronger test system than me or a lot of websites have. Will TR's results were definitely quite a bit better than this and beat my Radeon 7. But again, it costs twice as much. Twice as much. And look at what's happening here. Radeon 7's delivering 144 Hz gaming for those who want to do 1440p. This is a very pretty game. But let's look at the overall results. What can we say here? Well, we can say that in 1440p, Radeon 7 is an upgrade to Vega 64. At stock settings to stock settings where you get a 30% boost. But again, the same for price performance. You need not apply if that's what you want. But it is notably stronger. And it does beat the 1080 Ti firmly. I don't know where these people coming from calling Radeon 7 a 1080 Ti are, but... you gotta cherry pick, right? Like, if you cherry pick the 1080 Ti beating the Radeon 7 stock to stock, well, great. I'll cherry pick Vega 64 beating the 1080 Ti on stock. I mean, we can both do this all day. On average, the Radeon 7 is better than the 1080 Ti. It is a bit stronger, or at least equal to the 2080 if I threw it in here. But the thing is, this thing's never running out of memory, right? If we move on to 4K, good luck having the 2080 keep up in all of these games that use over 8 gigabytes of RAM. They're just not going to. And as you can see, the 1080 Ti is a decent 4K gaming card still. It pulled up to where it was, relatively speaking. And that's why I say, if you're a budget 4K gamer, you use Vega 56 or 64 with high bandwidth cache. Or you probably already have a 1080 Ti, right? You got a used one or something. And if that's not what you want something brand new and nice, I guess Radeon 7 is the card to get, right? Again, not the best price performance, but it's right next to the 2080 Ti after you overclock it in 4K. And I know the 2080 Ti is stronger. I know you can overclock the 2080 Ti another 10 to 20%, but it also costs twice as much and has less video RAM. And that 11 gigabytes will be a problem. That's an awkward number that will not age well. And that's on purpose. NVIDIA wants it to not age well. They want you to have to get a new card once games start using at least 12 gigabytes. There's my results of comparing the Radeon 7 to my Vega 64, both of them overclocked. Some polled results for what I believe are the cards that should be compared. The 2070, because its price performance isn't astronomically horrible, and it's near the high end. And then the RTX 2080 Ti, because that's really the top cut down card from NVIDIA, and the Radeon 7, whether people like it or not, for now, is the top cut down card from AMD. And of course, I threw the 1080 Ti in because there's plenty of people who game in 4K who still own one. And like I said, keep in mind that 2080 Ti can be overclocked another 10% almost always, and that, as Will, and thanks again to Will TR909, the best 2080 Ti's can get another 20% probably, or another 15, we'll say, percent. And so, yeah, it's always going to be, 5 to 20% stronger than the Radeon 7. But it costs twice as much, right? And that's my point. Also, keep in mind my i7 6700K was definitely holding this thing back, as me and Will compared some results of cards back and forth. And again, shout out to him for helping me there. I need a new CPU if I'm going to do any benchmarking for you guys moving forward, especially when we get into games next year. But anyways, let's get to the end of this conclusion here, and the real conclusion. Who is this graphics card for? Well, there's the first person this is for. Are you a Vega user who perhaps had a Vega Frontier or cheaped out even more and got a Vega 64 for non-gaming uses? This is for you. Or if you have money to blow as well, I suppose, right, you could justify it then. It's much better price performance, right, than the 2080 Ti, and it's better than the 2080 in my opinion. So I guess, but, right, you're comparing it to the two worst price cards in history. So it's really only if you're going to use it for non-gaming tasks. And I do. And as I demonstrated, this thing gets over 100 mega hash. And it's brilliant at that. And on that note, actually, it has been a godsend for me upgrading to this card. Yesterday, I was about to, I was finishing up a video, and before I uploaded it, I, of course, had to render it all together. And my internet actually went down about 30 minutes later. And I was able to upload it to YouTube early and get it, processed and everything on time, because it literally rendered twice as fast as my old Vega 64. This thing is a rendering beast. And I render, and I'm so happy I have it. In fact, it was at 72% usage while it was rendering, meaning I was able to do all these other things on my YouTube channel at the same time. This is like the Threadripper of graphics cards. No, it doesn't max out games as well as the top NVIDIA card. Like, Threadripper isn't as good at gaming as a 9900K. But all those threads, all this graphics bandwidth, you can do a bazillion things. I can mine at maximum intensity, and this thing will just browse the web, play 4K videos. It doesn't matter. It's just relaxing while it's mining at 101 mega hash. And this is a very big deal here, too, for professional users. When I used to own a Vega 64, and this is a very big deal for me that I've liked the most about this card, right, I would have a overclock for gaming, I would have a one for rendering, and then I would have one for mining. And I had it set to switch depending on what application I opened. It's not like I had to always, manually set the clocks every time I switched applications. But it sometimes wouldn't apply correctly, or I noticed that just because it was stable forever mining, it would still become unstable after I stopped mining and played a game. So I'd reboot between, right? I'd reboot before I render. I'd reboot my PC before I mined. I'd reboot my PC before before I went back to mining. I had to reboot a lot. I don't have to anymore. I can go from mining at 100 mega hash to rendering to game. I haven't turned the thing off for days, and it just does it. And that's because this is the Threadripper of graphics cards. That's what this is. And for people who do those things, I don't just mean one of them, but if you're someone like me who mines, does professional work, and games on one beast PC, this is the card to get. This is the card to get. Honestly, if it's not this, Titan RTX after this, and that's 4 times the price. So, this is the card to get for semi-professionals. Really, this is the ultra semi-professional card. And number 2 is, what if you're building a new PC and you want a great 4K gaming card, but you don't want to sell a car to get the 2080 Ti? That's the second type of person I could kind of see this being for, right? Like, you have a 1070 Ti, a 1080, a Vega 64, or something like that. You don't want to spend $700 and upgrade. Like, it's really only, honestly, in 1080p, like 10-20% stronger. And in 4K, it only gets up to about 30-40%. It's definitely not worth $700 to upgrade if you have an existing decent card. But if you're building a new PC, this is not a budget 4K gaming card like a Vega 56 with high bandwidth cache turned on. But this is better than the 2080 Ti, and it will age well, and it has enough RAM to last you a few years. Heck, it could probably run 8K 30 frames per second because of that giant buffer, right? So, yeah, that's who that's for. It's either for people like that who are building an entirely new system from scratch and want a capable 4K gaming card. This is the card to get, in my opinion. This is. But, and this is where I get into the final negatives, understand what you're getting here. This is a semi-professional card. It is definitely more like a Vega Frontier. There aren't 2 BIOSes. There's one BIOS. Its fan it's not that loud. Really, I'll touch on that now. It doesn't get very loud. I think I'm not even going to mention it much because of how dumb that argument is. But it gets louder than like other cards I've had. It's a lot quieter than the stock cooler on Vega 64. And I know everyone goes, no shit, Sherlock. No, but the Vega 64 was a lot quieter than the GTX 580s or certainly quieter than the 290X launch cards. So it is quieter than blower coolers. Everyone keeps mentioning the noise. No, it's not as quiet as, these triple slot, but it's not a triple slot card. It's quieter than them though, but it has an odd fan curve, and I think it's because it's using, I think they just copy and pasted from one of their professional cards, the fan curve, honestly. And I know the MI150 doesn't, or the MI50 doesn't, have a fan on it, but I guarantee you there's other versions of this with fans, and I think they just literally found a fan that could use the same voltage curve, and just that's why they used that fan cooler. So that's what you're getting into. This is definitely the worst yields of a professional card. They did the minimum to compete, but they only had to do the minimum because RTX is so expensive. All right. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed my review. I put a lot of effort into this. Patreon members can talk with me directly on Discord in depth about not just this, but what my next videos will be, what they thought. A lot of back and forth there. So support me there. If not, please like and subscribe. Share my videos. Man, sharing really helps. Tell me what you think in the comments section below. I know I'm going to get a ton of hate from people, but you know what? That is how I see the Radeon 7. I usually don't see things the same way as other channels, and I think that's why I'm doing all right, All right. Thank you.